All right. Thank you so much for inviting me here today. My name is Amy, and I am the Geospatial Science Fellow at National Parks Conservation Association, or NPCA for short. And today I'll be sharing with you how NPCA is using geospatial data and storytelling to enhance protection for national parks. Oops, sorry. So to give some more background on our work and how we work, we are an advocacy organization founded in 1919 by the first director of the National Park Service, as he saw a need for parks to have an independent voice outside of the federal government. And so parks face many threats from adjacent development, lack of funding, pollution, climate change, and etc. And our advocates use many approaches, such as public engagement, coalition building, and policy development to protect and preserve America's national parks. We on the conservation science team have used science, data, and maps in the past to tell impactful stories around our advocacy campaigns. So first, I wanted to begin by asking what a national park contains. Oftentimes, a lot of people think of national parks as nature reserves and for recreation. However, national parks are the intersection of many different elements. So there's ecology, geology, paleontology, communities, since national parks really tie into the economies of gateway communities. It can also include environmental justice, culture, and history. And by understanding the full scope of what parks can encompass, we can start to better understand and improve parks as models of a healthy ecosystem, clean air and water, and healthy communities. And storytelling and maps in particular can help tie all of these elements together and tell the where of a national park story that's both data-driven, informative, and aesthetic to inspire action. However, protecting national parks often goes beyond its boundaries, since most parks interact with adjacent lands and their boundaries don't encompass all of the like species habitats, regional habitats, migration, and other ecological elements that spill over into adjacent areas. And this map of Yellowstone by the University of Wyoming is a really great example showing how these different elk herds migrate in and out of the park and encompasses an area much larger than the park boundaries itself. And as you can see, there's lots of different land ownership types in the greater Yellowstone area. And so different uses of these adjacent lands can have adverse impacts on park resources and visitor experiences. So in reality, park protection requires a larger landscape approach. And so at NPCA, we're developing a framework for large landscape conservation. We've identified 18 focal landscapes anchored around national parks with high conservation value in partnership with NatureServe, which is a conservation data provider. And so to walk you through some of the steps for our framework, first we began by identifying the study areas, and here we collaborate very closely with our regional staff who are in touch with local stakeholders and communities to identify conservation values and intersecting those natural ecosystem breaks, such as watersheds, rivers, species habitats, etc., like we've mentioned before. Then we continue to work with our regional staff and stakeholders to identify conservation values, which can include both social and ecological. And then we worked with NatureServe to combine some of these data layers together into a conservation value index. And the 3 layers they used were biodiversity, climate connectivity, and climate resilience to produce this conservation value layer. Next, using this layer, we examined areas with the highest conservation value index alongside those other relevant socio-ecological layers that I mentioned earlier, and along with what our advocacy goals are for that region. And lastly, and this is where the storytelling part comes in, is to create resources for advocacy. That can look like a lot of different things. It can look like data visualizations, cartographic maps, a variety of storytelling media to really start to garner support, not just for our staff, but also all the communities and representatives that they work with for their advocacy campaigns. So next, I wanted to bring up a case study, zooming into one of our study areas. Big Thicket National Preserve is a really awesome park in East Texas, right where that star is. And this park is really amazing because it encompasses 9 ecosystems that are very rich in biodiversity. And some people have referred to it as the biological crossroads of America. However, there's one iconic and historic resident species that's been missing from this park, which is the red cockaded woodpecker. It unfortunately hasn't been seen in Big Thicket since the 1990s because it only nests in longleaf pine forests, which have also vastly decreased in this area due to fire suppression, logging, and urbanization. So as you can see in the map in the top left, there's a high degree of overlap between red cockaded woodpecker ranges and longleaf pines. And as you can see, Big Thicket, the boundary in this green, in the middle is split into several different units, and it's pretty disconnected with multiple different types of land uses and landowners in between. So that brings us to our Texas team's advocacy goals, the first of which is park expansion. How can we expand the park, work with different landowners in the area to help make Big Thicket more connected? Second is to reintroduce the red cockaded woodpecker back to Big Thicket. And the third is to restore the longleaf pine forest that they depend upon. However, as we saw in the top left map, some existing habitat and species data is not fine-grained enough for this resolution of an area we're looking at to identify smaller parcels for our goals. So far, our Texas team has completed an on-the-ground ecological survey in just one of the units of Big Thicket. But as I mentioned earlier, with the large landscape approach in mind, we began to ask what areas inside and adjacent to Big Thicket's boundaries have suitable habitat for red cockaded woodpeckers. And so with NatureServe, we produced several layers of ecological data, such as red cockaded woodpecker habitat suitability model, longleaf pine condition, and high conservation value areas. And as you can see, this is just one example of one of the layers that were produced, the red cockaded woodpecker habitat suitability model, which shows a lot of potential areas around Big Thicket that could be suitable for red cockaded woodpeckers beyond the survey area. So all of this yellow that you see around are suitable habitat, and a lot of it is outside of the boundary of Big Thicket. So we further took all of these different layers along with the others they said were important to look at, such as floodplain layers, population areas, land ownership, put all of these layers into an interactive web app. So you can really zoom in on specific areas to look at the ecological values and others that are relevant for our Texas team. And this can really help to start to really identify like which exact parcels we want to start with for our advocacy strategies. And all of this data is really great for us as GIS professionals to know, but it really all comes down to how we communicate all of this in an engaging way to the local public, stakeholders, and representatives to get that local support. So we created a written story and infographics to explain why this matters to them, get people excited through science, and explain how data is supporting locations for park expansion and woodpecker reintroduction. So this is the story that we put together. We start by really putting the red cockaded woodpecker at the center of the story, really showing how amazing it is as a species, where they live, the important facts and figures about them to get people just excited about them, and why they depend on longleaf pine, why both populations have declined, and explaining the really critical relationship between fire in this area, in which both of these species really need fire to thrive. So we're helping also use science to dispel some fear and myths about wildfires, as well as highlighting what the benefits of longleaf pine brings to local communities. And then there's another small piece showing our Texas team in action, helping out with red cockaded woodpecker banding with another organization to start to get the audience used to the idea that this has been happening in other areas and it could potentially happen for Big Thicket. And then next, to round it all out, we talk about the economic benefits of bringing back wildlife to this area in Texas and why restoration matters for them and for their communities. That's really at the heart of what a lot of local communities care about. So it's really important to tie that all back. And lastly, we end with all the data and explaining our approach and how the campaign is really supported with this data as evidence. And so as a recap for some storytelling tips, first, it's really important to identify your audience, like I mentioned, and identify your takeaway message. Our takeaway message in this piece is that bringing back the red cockaded woodpecker and longleaf pine forests will contribute to a healthy ecosystem in Big Thicket, which will attract tourists to the area and bring a lot of economic and community benefit. And you should really start with the why. Why should this issue matter to the audience? And then break the science and data down into graphics and smaller pieces. Like the pieces you saw in the previous slide, it was a lot of visuals broken down into small little paragraphs to kind of make it more accessible for the audience to understand the science and get excited about it. And the last piece of advice I have is to start with the big picture and get into the smaller details. And that's why we decided to, save the data piece closer towards the end and start with the big picture and start with the why it's important. So lastly, all of this has really helped kick off a new partnership with a conservation finance organization, where we're actively going to be using that web app to identify parcels and landowners for park expansion. And the written story is going to be shown to the local public, stakeholders, etc., to support the story for Big Thicket and the case for conservation. And lastly, to really dispel misconceptions about fire as a forest management technique as well. And so I want to thank everyone for listening and hope this provided some valuable information for you. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. It gave a great insights on how the conservation and national parks are using geospatial technology to implement and preserving the biodiversity of the of any of these national parks, with especially. And is anybody has any questions, or we can take the questions in the end after the presentation by Mr. Kapil? Is it okay, Ami? We can do that way. Okay. Okay. So we'll take the present questions after Mr. Kapil's presentation. So thank you, Amy. Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation once again. And now I invite Mr. Kapil to please take on the stage and showcase your presentation, sir.
Thanks, Swati. Just bear with me a minute. I think I have the right screen here. All right. Just to be sure, you are seeing my screen on National Parks and Ecosystems?
Yes, we are seeing.
Great. Amy, thanks for a wonderful context and background. And I'm sorry, I'm coming at it slightly differently in time zones as well. It's 2:30 a.m. in Vietnam, where I am right now. And it just actually woke me up, and this really was exciting to listen to what you were saying. What I'm sharing with you is with my background on two projects as a landscape architect and as an ecologist. I'm going to bring to you, let's see, how do I forward these slides? All right, here we go. Two projects I want to share with you that I've worked with over time. This is on the extreme west part of India. I spend a lot of my time shuffling between India and Vietnam, and both my examples today to you are actually from India. This is the tiger reserve of Ranthambore, which is in the state of Rajasthan on the extreme west part of India. It's a very interesting, seemingly dry, arid landscape, but very valuable pockets of water. And that's kind of what makes it interestingly rich, is having this landscape interspersed with water bodies which are created from shallow pools of rainwater runoff. And basically the geology is what drives this whole ecosystem over here. Now, unfortunately, the tiger and mankind interaction is the challenge. And Amy, as you outlined very well, multiple pressures on the national parks. So this tiger reserve is what I have worked with, and it's one of the healthiest ones in a way that there is a large tiger population. But what that does also is bring up this question about what exactly is the tiger habitat over here. And everybody is always trying to muscle in on the land and trying to see what part they can take over. So this is an old historic fort, which is part of the national park now, but just gives you an idea that there has been human and wildlife interactions going back hundreds of years in this landscape. So we've had the traditional Maharajas and their families have this land under their management and have old forts and complexes here. But then what the tiger likes is actually the dry grass thickets to be moving in, and actually makes for a wonderful experience as a wildlife safari out here. And this picture on the right is actually taken about 10, 12 years ago, where the landscape was more natural, more wild. And there have been a lot of problems since then about letting the natural, unmanaged landscape be there for the animal habitat. This is just to give you a sense, and actually the area is so vast and its geography is so absolutely amazing that if you were just getting a chance to enjoy the landscapes, it would be valuable in itself. So the upper left corner is where the old fort is, and this land extends way past the lower right corner of the screen as well. So the challenge is that we've been facing here is for the forest department to even know the limits of their land. It sounds kind of funny, but because of the terrain, because of the different land ownerships over time, it's actually difficult to clearly establish where the limits of the forest reserve are. And the tiger doesn't know about that. The tiger just keeps moving as per the habitat and what they've always known. And as the villages encroach into these lands and as peripheral urban settlements start cutting into the land, we have more tiger human interface and conflict. So the last time I was here, there was the big challenge, and why we were doing the forest mapping was because one of the villagers had gone into the forest area with his donkey to collect firewood. And it's a difficult livelihood for some people around here, um, foraging the forest and having non-timber revenue or having other forest products that they would pick up on the side and be able to sell was basically their mainstay. And it so happened on this one particular incident that it got late and the donkey and the owner were mauled by the tiger. And that's what brought us in, because even though there are 32 tigers over here and they're very valuable, the moment there is one incident, the human being doesn't get penalized for his foolishness, but the tiger gets penalized. And the tiger has, once has tasted human blood, is taken out of this natural system, put away, and generally put down. So it hurt a lot of us, and as a community who was involved with this as providing free support to the forest department, we were pretty hurt about this. So what we've been trying to do over years is actually bring resources, bring students into this program to work with the forest department and have a symbiotic learning. The forest department gets the benefit of a GIS driven thought process, gets access to data, now gets access to more improved drone data of the urban areas, starts getting a cadastral mapping in place, and starts tagging and tracking movement of vehicles, tourist vehicles especially, so that we limit the interactions between the natural habitat and the tiger and the human being. So trying to reduce conflict is one critical part of where we try to introduce the GIS. The other part is that by changing laws in India, the tribal communities, resident tribal communities, have rights in this ecosystem as well. So trying to give them access has become a challenging part, and trying to give them rights to use the forest, albeit in their own human ecological way, has become an important part. So I don't think that we are going to be easily successful, and these kind of stories of human nature conflict are continuing to happen, continuing to grow. So there is no easy out for us with a rapidly increasing population, weakened resources of the National Park Services equivalents in India, and simply a lack of clear data. It smacks of a lot of opportunity and a lot of things that need to be done. But more than anything else, data needs to be available and tools need to be available to the tiger habitat management agencies, pretty much the National Park Service, the Tiger Reserve Service there. We've tried to work with the local politicians, the members of legislative assemblies, try to work with state governments and talk to them about the difference between if we are going to restore the tiger habitat, and you'll see a lot of news media stuff globally about India and its tiger program, but that's where this program came from, was an understanding that we need to protect the habitat to get the numbers up. We need to make the habitat more protected, and this human ecosystem and natural ecosystem needs to balance out and work together. We can't throw the native communities and tribals out of the forest areas because their lives depend on it. And actually, they help manage the place. So you do not have a problem of invasives taking over, and you don't have a problem of the ecosystem falling into disarray because of other human intervention activities over here. But it is a slow moving, um, positive story right now, and things are beginning to turn around. And I'm kind of glad that we can claim that we've been a part of this story of helping make a change to this tiger reserve area. My other little example of planning work, which we do, urban planning, ecological planning, we do is the other extreme of India, is on the extreme east side in the state of Assam. Assam is known as the gateway to Northeast India, and it's an interesting geography and landscape of mountainous ecosystem of the tail end of the Himalayas, the Brahmaputra River, huge water bodies, but then very rapidly growing cities as well. So Deepor Beel, as it is known, Beel as a water body, as a lake, Deepor Beel is actually the largest water body in the state of Assam, which is surrounded by urbanization on all sides. A little smattering of this Google image that you can see. On the upper left side, we've got the city. On the lower right side, we've got a major highway. On the east side, the right side, running is the major highway from the airport. So Deepor Beel is like a beautiful gateway to the city. It's a fantastic ecological landscape, and I'll just kind of share with you the vastness of it. It strikes you. A parallel I take from the US would be like if when you go to Crater Lake, Oregon, and you feel that expanse. This is kind of what you feel when you visit the Beel in Assam. But it's a very rich wetland ecosystem protected, theoretically protected as a Ramsar site under the Global Convention. And I leave that as a kind of a tongue in cheek that's theoretically protected. And it's supposed to be protected and managed and is well managed by these native communities. So these fishermen communities are out on their little boats. They harvest fish in a what I would call a completely sustainable manner. They use local materials, their livelihoods, lives, entire communities depend on the health of this ecosystem. So they will self-police and they will self-manage and they will do a fantastic job of living off the ecosystem and having this balance of life. Here again, our problem is the urbanites, the species which destroys everything is the urban settlement. And this is really what is happening in this lake is water bodies, tributaries flowing into this, people dumping garbage. And actually in a dry season, the city government actually created a landfill on the edge of this lake. So the depressing part is that the Beel tends to be shrinking in its ecological footprint. The positive side of it is that mapping, documenting, and putting across the expanse and the extents of this lake, we documented from time series Google imagery data going as far back as we could, actually into 1968, 1970. We had some of the oldest imagery, and we were able to talk about the original footprint and show how much land encroachment has happened and that what core part of the lake system still remains and it should be protected and managed. So the pleasurable part is that a couple of months ago, finally, using historic lands, historic satellite imagery, using the overlay maps, using the presence of village records, we were able to get an entire edge of this river, of this Deepor Beel area. I think it was a land parcel which had about 16 to 18,000 people, houses, commercial buildings, were all notified as illegal developments and were formally bulldozed and removed, and the land areas currently back into a restoration strategy. So the tide is turning, and we are finding that using records of satellite imagery to show where historic land ownerships in a way were, where the ecological footprint was, and actually start working carefully on where the ecological and human ecological balance can happen, and trying to protect and build up on that is really our battle right now. These ventures are all unfunded mandates now. I mean, our official assignments finished long ago. We continue to work with these little activities. And as a consulting practice, we're kind of mentally committed in this direction. But yes, the challenge remains on trying to boost up and get these organizations more proactive. The surprising advent of WebGIS and actually Corona has been a very interesting blessing that's given us more support in building tools and technologies which allow these organizations now to have a cheaper GIS as an open source or as an ArcGIS online solution, having troves of satellite data, having other students and people work with them, OpenStreetMaps and other public source data coming in is definitely helping a lot. But we are in a very organic community self-help approach, not as well organized as the NPCA is. But definitely from what I had going on about 10 years ago to where we are, I think we're kind of turning the corner. I hope that we manage to keep pushing in the right direction, and we kind of hope to see more data-driven analytical thought process in how to balance nature and humankind together. That's my 2 bits of sharing practical projects and problems that I have lived with. Love to take away a lot more on the storytelling part from what Amy talked about and be able to bring that in. But Amy, if you had volunteers, you could send us all the way over to this part of the world. Hey, I'd be really happy about that. Thanks much, everyone, for your patience.
Thank you, Kapil, for a wonderful presentation, giving an insight of the 2 very important issues of national parks. That's one is the Tiger Reserve and the ecosystem of Dipor Beel in Assam. So it was wonderful. Do we have any questions from any of our participants, or anybody would like to ask any questions from the speakers?
Can I ask some questions from Amy?
Yeah, sure.
Amy, what kind of a team resource space is needed to actually get story maps going and as a living story between communities and officials? What do we really need to do to work towards in terms of people, equipment, and resources that makes this happen?
That's a really great question. I think storytelling is something that can kick off that process, because people, and especially local people who aren't familiar with the full scope of the issue, need to know the story first before knowing how they can participate, and how to add their voice into this movement. So I think there also needs to be people who help, like people like our team who helps communicate that, or some part of an organization that needs to fill that gap and pay attention to the public outreach part. I think starting there, then we can start to ask like what equipment is needed. It'll get people excited and more wanting to participate in maybe some kind of organizing group, like local residents organizing group, I'm not a specialist on the advocacy side, but that's how I've seen that local people can amplify their voice. And we, as on the technical side, I think we should use geospatial data to help empower their knowledge, and so they can add their voice constructively and be able to collectively organize together. I think when local politicians see that local group organizing, they start to pay attention and start to hear their voices more, and hopefully actually consider the concerns they have with their own experiences, and empowered by the knowledge that they've been given about what's happening.
That's a good takeaway to understand, and yeah, to sow the seeds locally and have them kind of take root and expand in the community. That's well put. That's something that, yeah, we need to take away and work with that at our end. Thanks much, Amy.
Yeah, and I had a question for you as well. I think what you said about the first project you mentioned about human wildlife conflict in areas that have tiger populations, very interesting. I guess that's something that I hadn't considered as much, like the human animal conflict part in our work, because there's definitely a lot of areas near national parks, especially in the West, where there is a lot of like ranching land that could potentially have like human wildlife conflicts, especially bears. I think bears are usually seen as like a big scary animal for a lot of people in the US. So I was curious to ask you about how how to put what you've learned about human wildlife conflict like into action.
From the tiger reserve, the lesson that we learned was that the tiger wants a certain habitat. So you can create that, you can enrich parts of it. And it was really interesting how the forest ranges work, that if they wanted tigers to stay away from a certain area, they would drain the water body. You know, it's hot landscape, and the tiger is going to look for shade, is going to look for water, and more so the water, because that's where the prey is going to come. So it was a very interesting learning that you can't fence in the tiger, you can't fence in the wildlife, but what you can do is you can figure out where they go, why they go, and try to work on that. So you preserve, strengthen, enrich the core part of the habitat area. So that's what you do, or we learned as what they were doing with the tiger. The other part was managing people. People are bluntly foolish. I mean, you know, it's they will want to. If you go to the zoo, they want to tease the animal. They go to the national parks, and they're like, "Why can't I just drive my car everywhere I want to go?" So the tiger reserve works with a list of authorized battered old jeeps which take people through. So what is interesting is by limiting the number of jeeps and limiting the routes they could take, they were able to minimize just people wandering off and going into the core habitat. The part that we're not able to work with is the local native communities, the farmer and the tribal, because they've got a tough life. In a sense, they have to eke out a living. And a lot of resentment because lands were acquired for the tiger reserve, but the farmer still wants to go back and farm that land. There's no easy answer to that. Again, than understanding why we had this problem was that it's kind of the taste for the animal. I was told that donkey meat is a much loved, desired meat by the tiger. So you either educate the farmer, you go in there, but you don't take your donkey with you, so you're less of a target. And it's surprising that, you know, because these tigers are used to seeing humans, they're used to having tiger safaris coming through, they're not disturbed by humans actually. And they don't disturb humans and vice versa. So it's kind of like they've got to accept each other. But the foolishness is, or the limitation is, you take this walking four-legged steak into the park and the tiger looks at it and is like, yum, I gotta have it. And then the owner wants to defend and protect his livestock. That's the problem. So actually the problems are more where cattle livestock is being maintained or chicken farms are being done because that's attracting the tiger as coming out for easy prey. And that's the part we're not able to deal with because we get into the local politics and local things about why not? Why shouldn't I have the right to do what I want to do? So some good lessons to learn about working with these forest rangers and park guys to give them maps to show them how the landscape was changing, so they could actually work on restoring parts which were critical to the core. That was our real takeaway, and we learned that a tiger needs roughly a 25 square kilometer patch of a certain ecological integrity to be able to survive. So yeah, making sure that the core and the mapping of the parks gives you that sense of patch continuity. That you don't break that, don't fragment the landscape.
Thank you. I have a small question for Amy. You spoke about some frameworks in your presentation. Just wanted to know, are these frameworks geospatially driven or they are just the hypothetical as part of the conservation concept?
Can you repeat the last part of your question again?
Yeah,
disconnected.
I'm asking you mentioned about frameworks. I just wanted to know whether are they geospatially driven frameworks or it is just the conceptual conservation concept framework.
That's a great question. I would say it's both, because the heart of the framework is that it is a geospatial framework, but the heart of the framework is driven by how the geospatial data will help like advocacy for the national parks. And that advocacy naturally has to connect with the communities that are nearby and the local politicians. And so I think that's why we work really closely with our local office in that region, so that they can tell us what is important from their perspective as the local practitioners on the ground. Maybe, for example, in Texas, like they really care about the economic benefits that it could bring. There's a lot of flooding in that area, so we need to ask them and approach them first and ask what layers of information are important to your goals to support this park. Like what pieces of data or issues are do people care about near this park? And for that area, I think the big theme is like watersheds, flooding, and economic community benefits. So we take those more conceptual questions or conceptual issues that people care about, and then we ask what pieces of geospatial data can help us connect that to the conceptual issue and questions that they care about.
Thank you. Thanks so much. So we come to an end of this session of Lightning Talks, and I would like to thank both our speakers for taking out their precious time from their schedule and being with us today, especially Kapil who's awake at this midnight. It's early morning, right, Kapil there?
Don't try to wash it by telling me it's early morning. It's still nice.
Okay, so
thank you so much for organizing.
Yeah,
Swati, thank
and
you
we'll
for
have
this.
this presentations uploaded on our YouTube soon. So we'll send you the link for the same. So
okay, great. Thank you so much for organizing and staying so late.
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much. Thank you on behalf of Women in GIS.
Thanks,
you.
Swati. Thanks, Amy.
Bye,
Bye, guys.
guys. Take care.
Yeah.